My name is Vincent Kowalski, and I'm a truck driver who survived the first 48 hours of the zombie outbreak that started in Chicago. What began as a routine hospital delivery turned into a nightmare when patient zero arrived from a military research facility. I watched doctors and nurses transform into flesh-hungry monsters, fought my way through a zombie-infested parking garage, and led survivors through a collapsing city while society crumbled around us. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Vincent Kowalski, and for the past 15 years, I've been driving supply trucks to hospitals across the Chicago area. Every Tuesday, like clockwork, I'd make my rounds to 6 different medical facilities, restocking vending machines, delivering medical supplies, and maintaining the equipment that keeps these places running. Mercy General Hospital was always my last stop, and after 8 years of weekly visits, I knew every hallway, every staff member, and every shortcut through that massive building. I want you to understand something about truck drivers. We're not just people who drive big rigs from point A to point B. We're the backbone of America's supply chain. We know every route, every truck stop, every warehouse, and every loading dock from coast to coast. We talk to each other on CB radios, sharing information about road conditions, weather, and anything unusual we see out there. We're always prepared for emergencies because when you're hauling 40,000 pounds of cargo across the country, breakdowns and unexpected situations are just part of the job. That Tuesday, October 15th, started like any other. I'd been up since 4 in the morning, loading my truck with supplies at the distribution center on the south side of Chicago. The autumn air was crisp, and the sky was that perfect shade of blue you only get in October. I remember thinking it was going to be a good day. The radio was playing classic rock, traffic was light for a Tuesday afternoon, and I was making excellent time on my route. But there were things that morning that should have been warning signs. Things I didn't think much about at the time, but now I realize they were all connected to what was about to happen. When I was loading my truck at the distribution center, I noticed more military vehicles on the roads than usual. Not just one or two, but convoys of them heading north toward the suburbs. The security guard at the loading dock mentioned that they'd been seeing military transports all week, but nobody knew why. Then there were the news reports. I always keep the radio on while I'm driving, partly for traffic updates but mostly for company during those long stretches of highway. That morning, there were scattered reports about what they were calling animal attacks near some kind of research facility about 50 miles outside the city. The reports were vague, just mentions of people being treated for bite wounds and something about a quarantine zone being established. The news anchors seemed confused about the details, and honestly, I didn't pay much attention. Chicago's a big city. Weird stuff happens all the time. I should have paid attention. My first 5 stops that day went exactly as planned. Roosevelt Hospital, St. Mary's Medical Center, Chicago Children's Hospital, Northwestern Memorial, and Cook County General. At each location, I followed the same routine I'd been doing for years. Back the truck up to the loading dock, check in with security, grab my dolly and clipboard, and make my rounds. I knew most of the staff by name, and they knew me. We'd exchange pleasantries, maybe talk about the weather or the latest Cubs game, and I'd be on my way. But even at those earlier stops, there were small things that seemed off. More security personnel than usual. Hushed conversations between staff members that stopped when I walked by. At Northwestern Memorial, I overheard 2 doctors talking about some kind of special protocols being put in place, but they clammed up when they saw me listening. At the time, I figured it was just hospital politics or maybe some new bureaucratic nonsense from the state health department. I keep my truck stocked with emergency supplies. It's something every smart trucker does. You never know when you're going to break down in the middle of nowhere, or when bad weather is going to strand you for days. In the cab of my truck, I always carry extra food, water, A first aid kit, basic tools, spare clothes, and even a sleeping bag. I've got a CB radio setup that can reach truckers hundreds of miles away, and I maintain contacts with drivers all across the Midwest. We look out for each other out there. That afternoon, when I pulled into the parking garage at Mercy General Hospital, everything seemed normal. I found my usual spot on the second level of the underground garage, backed my truck up to the service elevator, and started unloading supplies. The garage was quieter than usual, but I figured it was just because it was mid-afternoon on a Tuesday. Most people were at work, and the hospital wasn't during peak visiting hours. I took the service elevator up to the third floor to start with the vending machines in the pediatric ward. This was always my favorite part of the job at Mercy General, because the kids section was usually bright and cheerful, even in a hospital setting. The afternoon sun was streaming through the large windows, and everything felt peaceful. I remember thinking that this was one of those days when the job didn't feel like work. Sarah Chen was one of the ER nurses I'd got to know over the years. She was in her early 30s, originally from California, and she'd moved to Chicago for the job at Mercy General about 4 years ago. She was one of those people who genuinely cared about her patients, the kind of nurse who would stay late to make sure someone was comfortable or had what they needed. She'd often stop by to chat when I was restocking the machines near the emergency department, and we'd talk about everything from hospital gossip to her attempts to find decent Chinese takeout in Chicago. Dr. Martinez was the head of emergency medicine, a guy in his 50s who'd been working at Mercy General for over 20 years. He was originally from Puerto Rico, and he had this calm, authoritative presence that made everyone feel safer when he was around. Even during the worst emergencies, Dr. Martinez never seemed to panic. He was the kind of doctor you'd want treating you if you were having the worst day of your life. I mention these people because they're important to what happened next, and because I want you to understand that these weren't just random characters in a horror story. They were real people with real lives, people I'd known for years, people who became central to my survival in ways I never could have imagined. It was around 2:30 in the afternoon when I finished restocking the vending machines on the third floor and started heading toward the elevator to go down to the main level. The hospital had that typical afternoon quiet, the kind where you can hear the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of medical equipment. I was wheeling my empty dolly toward the elevator bank, already thinking about my next stop and how I could get home in time to catch the evening news. That's when I heard Dr. Martinez shouting. Now, in 8 years of weekly visits to Mercy General, I'd heard Dr. Martinez raise his voice maybe 3 times, and those were during genuine medical emergencies when he needed to coordinate a trauma response. This was different. This wasn't the controlled urgency of a medical professional dealing with a crisis. This was raw fear, the kind of shouting that makes your blood run cold even when you don't know what's causing it. The sound was coming from the direction of the emergency department, 2 floors below where I was standing. Even through the floors and walls of the hospital, I could hear that something was very wrong. There were other voices too, people screaming and shouting, but I couldn't make out individual words. It sounded like chaos, like multiple emergencies happening at the same time. I pressed the elevator button, and while I was waiting, the shouting got louder and more desperate. I could hear what sounded like equipment being knocked over, maybe gurneys or medical carts crashing into walls. There were sounds I couldn't identify, sounds that didn't belong in a hospital. Growling, almost animalistic noises mixed in with the human voices. The elevator arrived with its usual cheerful ding, and when the doors opened, Sarah Chen stumbled out. I want you to understand that in all the years I'd known Sarah, I had never seen her anything less than completely professional and composed. She was one of those nurses who could handle anything from a screaming child with a broken arm to a multiple casualty car accident without breaking a sweat. She was trained to deal with medical emergencies, blood, trauma, and human suffering as part of her daily routine. But the person who stumbled out of that elevator was not the Sarah Chen I knew. Her scrubs were torn and stained with blood. There were deep, ragged bite marks on her left forearm, wounds that looked like they'd been made by human teeth. Her hair was disheveled, her face was pale, and her eyes had a wild, terrified expression that I'd never seen before. She was breathing hard, like she'd been running, and she kept looking back at the elevator as if she expected something to follow her out. When she saw me standing there with my dolly, she grabbed my arm with both hands. Her grip was strong, desperate, and I could feel her trembling. "Vinny," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "You need to get out of here, right now. Something's wrong with the patient from the military lab." I want to pause here for a moment because this was the first time anyone had mentioned a military lab to me directly, though it connected to those vague news reports I'd been hearing all morning. At the time, I didn't fully process the significance of what she was saying. I was too focused on the immediate crisis of seeing someone I knew and respected in a state of complete terror. "Sarah, what happened? Are you okay? Do you need medical attention?" I asked, looking at the bite marks on her arm. She shook her head frantically. "No, you don't understand. The patient they brought in from the research facility, he wasn't just injured. He was infected with something. He bit Dr. Rodriguez, and then Rodriguez started attacking people. They're not human anymore, Vinny. They're not thinking or reasoning. They just attack and bite and spread whatever this thing is." The lights went out. Not just the regular lights, but everything. The entire hospital was suddenly plunged into darkness, and a few seconds later, the emergency lighting system kicked in. Those red emergency lights that you see in every public building. The ones that are supposed to guide you to exits during fires or other emergencies, began casting everything in an eerie, blood-colored glow. From somewhere below us, probably from the emergency department, came a sound that I will never forget as long as I live. It wasn't human screaming anymore. It was something else, something that sounded like a combination of human voices and animal howls, all mixed together in a chorus of rage and hunger that echoed through the hospital's corridors. Sarah's grip on my arm tightened. "We have to get out of here," she said. "The infection is spreading faster than anyone thought possible. Everyone who gets bitten turns into one of them within hours, maybe less." I looked at the bite marks on her arm, and I think she saw the question in my eyes. "I don't know," she said quietly. "I don't know if I'm infected. I don't know how long I have. But right now, I'm still me, and right now, I need to help you get out of here alive." That's when I realized that my normal Tuesday afternoon delivery run had just become something else entirely. I was no longer Vincent Kowalski, supply truck driver making his weekly rounds. I was Vincent Kowalski, survivor, and the skills that had kept me safe on the highways for 15 years were about to be tested in ways I never could have imagined. The emergency lighting was casting long, red shadows down the hospital corridor. The sounds from below were getting louder and more chaotic. Sarah was injured and possibly infected with whatever had caused this outbreak. And somewhere in the parking garage 2 floors below us, my truck was waiting with all my emergency supplies and my only realistic means of escape. I made my first survival decision. I was going to get to that truck, and I was going to get out of Mercy General Hospital alive. Everything that happened after that moment stemmed from that one choice. "Sarah," I said, "I'm going to get my truck from the parking garage. Do you know any other way down there besides the main elevator?" She nodded. "There's a service stairwell on the east side of the building. It connects to the parking garage at the loading dock level. But Vinny, the garage might not be safe either. When the power went out, the security doors probably opened automatically. If those things got out of the ER..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. I understood. The underground parking garage, which had seemed like my sanctuary just an hour ago, might now be filled with infected people who had been patients, visitors, or staff members when the outbreak began. But my truck was down there. My supplies were down there. My CB radio was down there. And most importantly, my means of escape was down there. I've spent 15 years learning that in any emergency, the most dangerous thing you can do is panic. Panic makes you make stupid decisions. Panic makes you overlook obvious solutions. Panic gets you killed. So instead of panicking, I did what truckers do when faced with a crisis. I assessed the situation, made a plan, and started executing that plan one step at a time. Step 1 was getting to the service stairwell Sarah had mentioned. Step 2 was getting to the parking garage. Step 3 was getting to my truck. Step 4 was getting out of the hospital. Everything beyond that could wait until I'd accomplished those 4 basic objectives. We made our way through the hospital corridors toward the east stairwell, moving as quietly as possible. The emergency lighting was providing just enough illumination to see where we were going, but it was also creating deep shadows that could hide almost anything. Every corner we turned, every doorway we passed, could potentially contain one of those infected people Sarah had described. The hospital felt different now. It wasn't just the lighting or the sounds coming from the lower floors. The whole atmosphere had changed. This building that had been my second home for 8 years now felt hostile and dangerous. The familiar corridors seemed like a maze designed to trap us. As we walked, Sarah explained more about what had happened in the ER. The patient from the military research facility had been brought in around noon with what appeared to be severe bite wounds and some kind of fever. The paramedics who transported him said he'd been found unconscious at the facility after some kind of accident involving the research animals. Within an hour of arriving at the hospital, the patient had become violent and aggressive. He'd attacked Dr. Rodriguez, biting him severely on the neck and shoulder. Security had been called to restrain the patient, but by then, Dr. Rodriguez had already begun showing symptoms. Within 30 minutes, Rodriguez had transformed into something that wasn't quite human anymore. "It spreads through bites," Sarah said as we reached the stairwell door. "But it's not like rabies or anything we've seen before. The transformation is fast, and once someone is infected, they don't respond to reason or recognize people they knew. They just attack anything that moves." I pulled open the heavy stairwell door, and we both listened carefully for any sounds from below. The stairwell was dark except for the emergency lighting, and I could hear our footsteps echoing off the concrete walls as we started making our way down. That's when my CB radio crackled to life. I always keep a handheld CB radio clipped to my belt, connected to the main unit in my truck. It's how I stay in touch with other drivers, get traffic updates, and maintain contact with dispatch. But what I heard coming through that radio as we descended the stairwell was unlike anything I'd ever heard on the truckers' network before. "Breaker 19, this is Roadhog heading east on I-90. I've got major problems here, people. Chicago is going crazy. I'm seeing abandoned vehicles everywhere, fires, people running in the streets. Something big is happening, and it's not just traffic accidents." Another voice came on the channel. "Roadhog, this is Diesel Dan. I'm stuck in traffic on the Dan Ryan, and I'm seeing the same thing. Military vehicles everywhere, and something's wrong with the people. I just watched someone attack a cop at a traffic stop. The cop shot the guy 3 times center mass, and the guy kept coming." A third voice, one I recognized as belonging to Tommy Martinez, a driver I'd known for years. All units, this is southbound Tommy. Stay away from the hospitals. I repeat, stay away from all medical facilities. Something's happening there, some kind of disease or chemical leak. People are going crazy, attacking each other. I barely got out of St. Mary's alive." I keyed my radio. "Southbound Tommy, this is Supply Run Vinny. I'm at Mercy General right now. Can you give me more details about what you saw at St. Mary's?" "Vinny, get out of there right now," Tommy's voice came back immediately. "I don't know what this thing is, but it's spreading fast. The people who get infected, they're not people anymore. They're like animals, but worse. They don't stop, they don't get tired, and they don't feel pain. Whatever you do, don't let them bite you." Sarah looked at me with wide eyes. "It's not just here," she said. "It's happening at other hospitals too. We'd reached the second floor landing in the stairwell when we heard the first sound from the parking garage below. It was the sound of car alarms, multiple vehicles with their alarms going off simultaneously. But mixed in with the electronic wailing was something else. Human voices, but not human sounds. The same kind of animalistic howling we'd heard from the ER, but now it was coming from directly below us. I clicked my radio again. All units, this is Supply Run Vinny at Mercy General. I need to get to my truck in the parking garage, but it sounds like the garage might be compromised. Anyone have advice on dealing with these infected people? Vinny, this is Roadhog. I had to deal with a bunch of them about 10 miles back. They're attracted to sound and movement, but they're not smart. They can't open doors or operate equipment. If you can stay quiet and avoid them, that's your best bet. But if you have to fight them, go for head shots. Body shots don't seem to slow them down much. Copy that, Roadhog. Any idea how this whole thing started? Nobody knows for sure, but there are rumors it's connected to some kind of military research. Chemical weapons, biological warfare, something like that. All I know is it's spreading fast, and the government doesn't seem to have a handle on it. Sarah and I had reached the parking garage-level stairwell door. Through the small window in the door, I could see the red glow of emergency lighting reflecting off the parked cars. But I could also see movement, shadows shifting between the vehicles in patterns that didn't look like normal human behavior. I turned to Sarah. My truck is about 50 yards from this door, parked near the service elevator. I've got supplies, tools, and communication equipment in there. If we can get to it, we'll have a much better chance of getting out of here safely. She nodded. What do you need me to do? Stay close, stay quiet, and if something goes wrong, don't try to be a hero. Your job is to survive, not to save me. I want you to understand that at this point, I was still thinking like a truck driver dealing with a roadside emergency. I had a problem, I had a destination, and I had obstacles between me and that destination. My 15 years of experience had taught me how to handle unexpected situations, how to think clearly under pressure, and how to prioritize immediate needs over long-term concerns. What I hadn't fully grasped yet was that the rules of normal society no longer applied. The world I'd known that morning, the world where hospitals were safe places and doctors and nurses were there to help you, that world was gone. I was about to enter a new reality where survival depended on skills I'd never thought I'd need and decisions I'd never imagined I'd have to make. I opened the stairwell door as quietly as possible and stepped into the parking garage. The garage was a concrete maze of support pillars, parked vehicles, and emergency lighting that created more shadows than illumination. The sound of car alarms was much louder now, and I could hear the shuffling, scraping sounds of movement coming from multiple directions. But I could also see my truck, exactly where I'd left it, about 50 yards away near the service elevator. What I could also see were the infected people. There were at least a dozen of them scattered throughout the garage, moving aimlessly between the parked cars. Some were still wearing hospital gowns, others were in street clothes, and a few were wearing scrubs like Sarah's. They moved differently than normal people, with a jerky, unpredictable gait that reminded me of someone who was extremely drunk or suffering from a neurological condition. But there was something else about them that was immediately obvious, even in the dim emergency lighting. They were all covered in blood. Some had obvious bite wounds, others had injuries that looked self-inflicted, and all of them had blood around their mouths and on their hands. One of them, a middle-aged man in a business suit who might have been visiting a patient when the outbreak started, noticed us as soon as we entered the garage. He turned toward us with a movement that was too fast and too focused to be natural, and he made a sound that was part growl and part scream. That sound attracted the attention of the others. Within seconds, every infected person in the parking garage was moving in our direction with a determination and speed that was terrifying to witness. They weren't walking or running in any normal sense. They were charging, stumbling over obstacles but never stopping, never slowing down, never showing any sign of pain or fatigue. I grabbed Sarah's hand and started running toward my truck. This was the moment when my theoretical understanding of the situation became a visceral, terrifying reality. These weren't sick people who needed medical attention. These weren't confused patients who could be reasoned with or calmed down. These were predators, and we were their prey. The distance to my truck had never seemed longer. 50 yards across a parking garage should take less than 30 seconds to cover, but those 30 seconds stretched out like hours as we weaved between parked cars with a growing crowd of infected people pursuing us. I could hear their footsteps behind us, the sound of hands slapping against car hoods and trunks as they tried to cut off our escape route. I could hear their breathing, which sounded more like panting or snarling than anything human, and I could hear Sarah's labored breathing beside me as we ran. My truck was a 2018 Peterbilt 379, painted blue and white, with a 40-foot trailer attached. It was my mobile home, my office, and my lifeline all rolled into one. The cab was equipped with sleeping quarters, a small refrigerator, a CB radio setup, and enough storage space for everything I needed to live on the road for weeks at a time. More importantly, it was built like a tank. We reached the truck just as the first of the infected people rounded the corner of a nearby minivan. I fumbled with my keys for what felt like an eternity before finally getting the driver's side door open. Sarah climbed in first, and I followed, slamming the door behind us just as hands began pounding on the outside of the cab. For the first time since the lights had gone out upstairs, I felt like I could breathe again. The truck cab was familiar territory, my domain, the place where I was most comfortable and competent. I knew every switch, every gauge, every control panel like they were extensions of my own body. But as I sat there behind the wheel, listening to the infected people pounding on the outside of my truck and looking out at the chaos of the parking garage, I realized that getting to the truck had been the easy part. Now I had to get out of there alive. The inside of my truck cab had never felt more like a sanctuary, but I knew it was only temporary safety. Through the windshield, I could see at least 15 infected people surrounding my vehicle, their hands leaving bloody smears on the glass as they pounded against the windows and doors. The sound was relentless, like being trapped inside a drum while someone beat on it with hammers. Sarah was pressed against the passenger seat, her face pale in the red glow of the emergency lighting that filtered through the garage. The bite wounds on her arm had stopped bleeding, but I could see they were starting to look inflamed, the edges turning an ugly purple color that didn't look natural. I turned the key in the ignition, and my Peterbilt's diesel engine roared to life with a sound that was music to my ears. The infected people outside became more agitated when they heard the engine, their pounding becoming more frantic, but the truck was built to handle far worse abuse than anything they could dish out. My CB radio was already crackling with traffic from other drivers across the Chicago area. I grabbed the handset and keyed the microphone. Breaker 19, this is Supply Run Vinny at Mercy General Hospital. I'm in my truck in the parking garage, surrounded by infected people, looking for advice on the best way to clear a path to the exit. Vinny, this is Roadhog. How many are we talking about? At least 15 around my immediate area, probably more between here and the exit ramp. Copy that. I had a similar situation about an hour ago at a truck stop in Joliet. These things don't move out of the way like normal people. You're going to have to go through them. The good news is they're not smart enough to disable your vehicle. The bad news is they don't seem to feel pain or fear, so they won't back down. Another voice came on the channel, one I didn't recognize. This is Desert Pete calling from Route 88 westbound. Vinny, whatever you do, don't get out of that cab. I saw a driver try to clear them away manually about 30 miles back. They swarmed him in seconds. I looked at my fuel gauge. 3/4 full, plenty to get out of the city if I could just get out of this garage. I checked my mirrors and started planning my route to the exit ramp. The garage had a single exit that spiraled up to street level, and I could see infected people scattered all along that route. Sarah, I said, I need you to buckle up and hang on. This is going to be rough." She nodded and clicked her seatbelt into place. "Vinny, before we try this, there's something else you need to know about these infected people. In the ER, we notice they're attracted to sound and movement, but they also seem to be drawn to body heat. They can sense living people even when they can't see them clearly." That information was important, but right now I had a more immediate problem. I had to get this 40-ton truck and trailer moving through a parking garage filled with obstacles, both inanimate and very much animate. I put the truck in gear and started moving forward slowly. The infected people didn't move out of the way. They threw themselves against the front of the truck, some of them going down under the wheels, others grabbing onto the bumper and being dragged along. The sound of bodies hitting the front of the truck was something I'd never experienced before, and I hope I never have to experience again. But the truck kept moving. That's what these vehicles are designed for. They're built to haul massive loads across difficult terrain, and a few infected people weren't going to stop 40 tons of rolling steel. The problem came when I reached the first turn in the parking garage. The trailer, being 40 feet long, needs a wide turning radius to navigate corners safely. In a normal situation, I would take this turn slowly and carefully, making sure I had enough clearance on both sides. This wasn't a normal situation. As I started to make the turn, the back end of the trailer clipped a parked sedan, sending it sliding into a concrete support pillar with a crash that echoed through the entire garage. The sound attracted more infected people from the upper levels of the garage, and I could see them stumbling down the pedestrian stairwells and falling over the railings in their eagerness to reach us. "Vinny, we've got more company coming from above," Sarah said, pointing toward the upper levels where shadows were moving in the emergency lighting. My CB radio crackled again. "Supply run Vinny, this is southbound Tommy. I can see the entrance to Mercy General from Route 94, and you've got problems up here too. There are infected people all over the street level, and it looks like some kind of barricade situation with abandoned vehicles blocking the main road." That was not what I wanted to hear. Getting out of the parking garage was only the first challenge. Even if I managed that, I'd still have to navigate through infected-filled streets to reach a highway. I continued forward, the truck's engine growling as we climbed the spiral ramp towards street level. The infected people kept coming, throwing themselves at the truck with no regard for their own safety. Some of them were getting caught under the wheels, others were being pushed aside by the front bumper, but they never stopped trying to reach us. Halfway up the ramp, disaster struck. There was a loud bang from somewhere under the truck, followed by a grinding sound that every truck driver dreads. Something in the drive train had been damaged, probably by debris from the infected people or the vehicles I'd hit while maneuvering through the garage. The truck lurched forward for a few more feet, then started losing power. The engine was still running, but I could feel that something was seriously wrong with the transmission or the differential. "Sarah, we might have a problem," I said, checking my gauges and listening to the sounds the truck was making. "What kind of problem?" "The kind that means we might not be driving out of here." I managed to get the truck to the exit ramp that led to street level, but by then it was clear that the mechanical damage was severe. The truck would move, but only slowly, and with a grinding sound that told me the drive train was failing fast. Through the windshield, I could see the exit to the parking garage about 50 yards ahead. Beyond that was the street, and beyond that was the rest of Chicago. But between us and freedom were at least 30 infected people who had been drawn by the noise of the truck and the sound of the crash. My CB radio came alive with multiple voices, all of them offering advice and information that painted an increasingly grim picture of the situation outside. "Vinny, this is Roadhog. I'm monitoring emergency frequencies, and it sounds like this thing is spreading faster than anyone expected. They're reporting outbreaks at hospitals all over the city, and the military is setting up some kind of containment perimeter." "Supply run Vinny. This is Chicago Fire Department Truck 17. We're about 6 blocks from your location, but we can't get through. The streets are clogged with abandoned vehicles and infected people. You're on your own until we can find another route. Another voice, this one from a trucker I didn't recognize. All units, be advised that the infection seems to be connected to the hospitals and medical facilities. Word is that patients from multiple military research sites were brought to different hospitals across the city for treatment. And that's how this thing spread so fast. I put the pieces together in my head. The patient from the military research facility that Sarah had mentioned wasn't an isolated case. There had been multiple patients, brought to multiple hospitals, all of them infected with whatever this thing was. The medical facilities that were supposed to help them had instead become ground zero for a citywide outbreak. But right now, I had more immediate concerns. My truck was damaged and barely moving. We were surrounded by infected people, and I could see through the exit that the street level wasn't going to be any safer than the parking garage. I made a decision that probably saved our lives, though it felt like giving up at the time. Sarah, we're going to have to abandon the truck temporarily and find another way out of here. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Abandon the truck. This is the safest place we've been since this whole thing started. The truck's not going to make it much further, and if we get stuck halfway up that exit ramp, we'll be trapped. But I know this garage better than those infected people do. There's a service tunnel that connects to the building's mechanical systems. It runs under the street and comes up in the basement of the office building across from the hospital. I discovered that tunnel years ago when I was trying to find a bathroom during a particularly long delivery. It was part of the hospital's utility infrastructure, probably built in the 1960s when the building was constructed. It was narrow, dark, and not designed for human travel, but it might be our only option. How do you know about this tunnel? 8 years of weekly deliveries. You learn every corner of a building when you're trying to find the fastest route to the loading dock. I grabbed my emergency backpack from behind the driver's seat. It contained water, energy bars, a first aid kit, a flashlight, basic tools, and other supplies that I always kept on hand for roadside emergencies. I also grabbed my portable CB radio and clipped it to my belt. We're going to have to move fast and stay quiet, I told Sarah. The service tunnel entrance is about 20 yards from here, near the mechanical room. If we can get there without attracting attention, we might be able to get out of this garage without having to fight our way through that crowd. Sarah checked the bite wounds on her arm. They were looking worse, and I could see she was starting to feel the effects of whatever infection was spreading through her system. Her skin was pale, and she was sweating despite the cool temperature in the garage. Vinny, I need to tell you something. I can feel this thing changing me. It's not like any disease I've ever seen or studied. It's like it's rewriting my nervous system, making me want to do things that aren't normal. If I start to turn, if I become like them, you need to leave me behind. We're not there yet, I said. Let's focus on getting out of here first. I opened the driver's side door as quietly as possible. The infected people were still focused on the front of the truck, pounding on the windshield and trying to climb onto the hood. They hadn't noticed that we were no longer inside the cab. We slipped out of the truck and started moving toward the mechanical room, staying low and using parked cars for cover. The emergency lighting created deep shadows that we could hide in, but it also meant we couldn't see very far ahead. The mechanical room was exactly where I remembered it, marked with a small sign that read, "Authorized personnel only." The door was heavy steel, designed to keep unauthorized people out of the hospital's utility systems. Under normal circumstances, it would have been locked with both a key lock and an electronic access control system. But the power failure had disabled the electronic lock, and the physical lock had been damaged, probably by someone trying to hide in the room when the outbreak started. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see darkness beyond. I pushed the door open carefully and listened for any sounds from inside. The room was silent except for the hum of backup generators and the distant sound of water moving through pipes. "This is it," I whispered to Sarah. The tunnel entrance is in the back corner, behind the main electrical panel. We slipped inside the mechanical room and closed the door behind us. My flashlight revealed a typical hospital utility space, filled with pipes, electrical conduits, and mechanical equipment. The air was warm and humid, and it smelled like machine oil and cleaning chemicals. The tunnel entrance was exactly where I remembered it, a concrete opening about 3 feet square that disappeared into darkness. There was a metal grate covering the opening, but it was held in place with simple screws that I could remove with the multi-tool from my emergency kit. "You want us to crawl through that?" Sarah asked, looking at the narrow opening. "It's about 100 yards to the other end, and it comes up in the basement of the office building across the street. From there, we can get to street level and figure out our next move." As I was removing the screws from the grate, my CB radio crackled with a transmission that made my blood run cold. All units, this is emergency broadcast from the Illinois National Guard. The city of Chicago is under martial law effective immediately. All civilians are ordered to remain in their current locations and await evacuation. Do not attempt to leave the city. Repeat, do not attempt to leave the city. Military checkpoints have been established on all major highways. Sarah and I looked at each other. "Quarantine," she said quietly. "They're not trying to evacuate people. They're trying to contain the outbreak." "Which means," I said, "that getting out of this garage is only the beginning. We're going to have to get out of the entire city if we want to survive this." I finished removing the grate and shined my flashlight into the tunnel. It was narrow, concrete-lined, and disappeared into darkness beyond the range of my light. There were pipes and electrical conduits running along the ceiling, leaving just enough room for a person to crawl through if they kept their head down. "Ladies first," I said, trying to inject some humor into a situation that was becoming more desperate by the minute. Sarah crawled into the tunnel, and I followed behind her, pulling the grate back into place as best I could to hide our escape route. The tunnel was every bit as uncomfortable as I'd expected. The concrete was rough against my knees and elbows, and the air was stale and warm. But it was also quiet. For the first time since the outbreak began, we weren't surrounded by the sounds of chaos and violence. It was just the two of us, crawling through darkness toward an uncertain destination. About halfway through the tunnel, Sarah stopped moving. "Vinny," she said, and her voice had changed. It was weaker, more strained, and there was something else in it that I didn't like. "What's wrong?" "I can't see very well. Everything's getting blurry, and I feel like I'm burning up with fever." I could hear her breathing becoming more labored. The infection was progressing faster than either of us had expected. "How much further to the other end?" "Maybe 50 yards. Can you make it?" "I think so. But Vinny, when we get out of this tunnel, you need to be ready for the possibility that I might not be me anymore." We continued crawling through the darkness, but I could hear Sarah's condition deteriorating with every yard we covered. Her breathing was becoming more irregular, and she was making small sounds of pain or distress that she probably wasn't even aware of. When we finally reached the other end of the tunnel, I could see light filtering down from above through another grate. This one opened into what looked like a maintenance closet in the basement of the office building. I removed the grate and climbed up into the closet, then helped Sarah up behind me. She was burning with fever now, and her skin felt hot and clammy to the touch. The basement of the office building was dark except for emergency lighting, but it was blessedly quiet. No sounds of violence, no infected people, just the normal background hum of a building's electrical and ventilation systems. "We made it," I said. But when I turned to look at Sarah, I realized that our escape from the parking garage might have been the easy part of this ordeal. Her eyes were starting to show the same wild, unfocused expression I'd seen in the infected people at the hospital. The bite wounds on her arm were now completely black, and the infection was spreading up toward her shoulder in dark lines that looked like blood poisoning. We'd escaped from the parking garage, but we'd brought the infection with us. And somewhere above us, the streets of Chicago were filled with thousands of other infected people, while military checkpoints were being established to make sure that nobody, infected or otherwise, could leave the city. My truck was abandoned in a hospital parking garage with mechanical problems that might or might not be repairable. My CB radio was telling me that the outbreak was spreading to other cities, and the one person I'd been trying to help was rapidly becoming one of the creatures I was trying to escape from. But I was alive. I was armed with knowledge about how these infected people behaved, and I had 15 years of experience dealing with unexpected problems on the road. The next phase of my survival was about to begin, and it was going to take place on the streets of a city that was rapidly becoming a war zone. The basement of the office building felt like stepping into a tomb. The emergency lighting cast long shadows between the concrete support pillars, and the air had that stale, recycled quality you get in buildings where the ventilation system is running on backup power. But it was quiet, and after the chaos of the hospital parking garage, quiet felt like a luxury I couldn't afford to take for granted. Sarah was leaning against the wall next to the maintenance closet we'd climbed out of, and I could see the infection taking hold of her with frightening speed. The fever was making her shiver despite the warm air in the basement, and those dark lines from her bite wounds were spreading up her arm like ink in water. "Vinny," she said, and her voice was getting weaker, "I need you to listen to me carefully. I probably have maybe 30 minutes before I completely lose myself to this thing. There are things you need to know, things that might help you survive what's coming." I checked my watch. It was almost 6 o'clock in the evening, which meant we'd been dealing with this crisis for over 3 hours. In that time, a routine hospital delivery had turned into a fight for survival, and according to my CB radio, the entire city of Chicago was falling apart. "Tell me what you know," I said, keeping my voice calm even though watching someone I'd known for years slowly transform into a monster was one of the most difficult things I'd ever experienced. The patient from the military research facility wasn't the only one. Before the power went out, Dr. Martinez received a call from the CDC saying that similar patients had been brought to at least 6 other hospitals in the Chicago area. They were all from different military research sites, and they were all infected with the same thing. That explained how the outbreak had spread so quickly across the city. It wasn't one source of infection spreading outward from Mercy General. It was multiple sources, all activating simultaneously across Chicago's medical network. What else? The infection doesn't just spread through bites. It's also airborne, but only under certain conditions. High concentrations of infected people in enclosed spaces can create an aerosol effect. That's why the hospital ER became so dangerous so quickly. I processed that information. It meant that anywhere large numbers of infected people gathered, the air itself could become contaminated. Subways, shopping malls, office buildings, anywhere people might go to hide from the infected could become death traps. "Sarah, is there anything that slows down the infection? Any kind of treatment or medicine that might help?" She shook her head, and I could see that even that small movement was becoming difficult for her. "We tried everything we had in the ER. Antibiotics, antivirals, steroids, nothing worked. This isn't like any biological agent we've ever seen. It's almost like it was designed to be unstoppable." The word "designed" stuck with me. This wasn't some natural outbreak or accidental contamination. Someone had created this thing, and they'd created it to spread fast and be impossible to treat. My CB radio crackled to life with a transmission that confirmed my worst fears. "All units, this is northbound Jake monitoring emergency frequencies. I'm picking up military communications about something called Operation Clean Slate. Sounds like they're not planning to contain this outbreak. They're planning to sterilize it. Northbound Jake, this is Supply Run Vinny. What do you mean by sterilize?" "I mean they're talking about carpet bombing the infected areas once they get all military personnel to minimum safe distance. They're going to wipe out the entire Chicago metropolitan area rather than risk this thing spreading to other cities." Sarah looked at me with eyes that were becoming less human by the minute. How long do we have? I keyed my radio again. Jake, any time frame on this Operation Clean Slate? Hard to say, but the military chatter suggests they want all non-essential personnel evacuated from a 50-mile radius around Chicago by dawn. That gives them time to set up the bombing runs for sometime tomorrow morning. I looked at my watch again. If Jake was right, we had maybe 12 hours before the military decided that Chicago was a total loss and turned the entire city into a crater. Sarah, I need to get back to my truck. Even if it's damaged, it's still my best chance of getting out of the city before they start dropping bombs. She nodded weakly. The tunnel we came through, you can use it to get back to the parking garage. But Vinny, I'm not going with you. What do you mean? Look at me, she said, holding up her arm. The black lines from the infection had reached her shoulder and were starting to spread across her chest. I'm maybe 15 minutes away from becoming one of them. If I go with you, I'll just put you in danger. I want you to understand something about the decisions you have to make during a crisis like this. In normal life, you have time to consider options, to weigh consequences, to think about the ethical implications of your choices. But when survival is measured in minutes and seconds, you have to make decisions based on incomplete information and live with the consequences later. Sarah was right. Taking her with me would be dangerous for both of us. But leaving her alone in the basement of an office building to transform into one of those creatures felt like abandoning someone who had helped save my life. Is there anything I can do for you? I asked. Give me your flashlight and leave me the CB radio. If I can stay myself long enough, maybe I can monitor the emergency frequencies and pass along information to other survivors. I handed her the flashlight and the portable CB radio from my belt. Sarah, I want you to know that if we'd met under different circumstances, if this had been a normal day, I would have asked you out for coffee. She smiled, and for a moment she looked like the nurse I'd known for years instead of someone who was dying from an engineered plague. I would have said yes. I left her there in the basement and crawled back through the tunnel toward the hospital. The journey back seemed longer than the trip out, partly because I was alone and partly because I knew what I was crawling back toward. When I reached the parking garage end of the tunnel, I could hear that the situation above had gotten worse. There were more infected people in the garage now, and the sounds they were making had changed. Instead of the random growling and howling I'd heard before, there was something more organized about their behavior, almost like they were communicating with each other. I climbed back up into the mechanical room and listened at the door for several minutes before opening it. The emergency lighting in the garage was still functioning, but some of the fixtures had been damaged, creating areas of near-total darkness between pools of red light. My truck was exactly where I'd left it, surrounded by infected people who were still trying to get inside the cab. But there were more of them now, maybe 30 or 40, and they seemed more focused, more coordinated in their efforts. I needed to get back to that truck, assess the mechanical damage, and figure out if it could be repaired well enough to get me out of Chicago before the military turned the city into a parking lot. But first, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. During my 15 years of truck driving, I'd learned that rushing into a situation without proper reconnaissance was the fastest way to turn a manageable problem into a fatal disaster. I spent several minutes observing the infected people from the safety of the mechanical room. What I saw changed my understanding of what these creatures were capable of. They weren't just mindless zombies stumbling around randomly. They were learning. I watched one of them figure out how to open a car door by trial and error. I saw another one climb onto the hood of a vehicle to get a better vantage point. They were retaining motor skills and problem-solving abilities, even though they'd lost their human reasoning and empathy. That made them much more dangerous than I'd initially thought. My CB radio, the one still mounted in my truck, was broadcasting continuously. I could hear fragments of conversations from other drivers, emergency responders, and military personnel. The picture they painted was terrifying. The outbreak had spread beyond Chicago. Similar incidents were being reported in Detroit, Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Indianapolis, all cities with major medical centers that had apparently received infected patients from military research facilities. This wasn't an accident or a containment failure. This was a coordinated attack using America's medical infrastructure as the delivery system. But I couldn't worry about the bigger picture right now. I had to focus on the immediate problem of getting back to my truck and getting out of the city. I studied the layout of the parking garage and planned my approach. The infected people were concentrated around my truck, but they weren't evenly distributed. There was a clear path along the south wall that would get me within about 20 feet of the driver's side door. I also noticed something else that might be useful. The infected people were attracted to sound and movement, but they seemed to lose interest in stationary objects after a while. Several of them had wandered away from my truck and were now investigating other areas of the garage. I waited until the largest group had moved toward the far end of the garage. Then I made my move. The sprint from the mechanical room to my truck took about 30 seconds, but it felt like the longest half-minute of my life. I stayed low, moved as quietly as possible, and used parked cars for cover whenever I could. I made it to the truck without being detected, but getting inside was going to be the tricky part. The infected people were still pounding on the windshield and trying to climb onto the hood. Opening the door would definitely attract their attention. I needed a distraction. I picked up a wrench from my toolbox and threw it as hard as I could toward the opposite end of the garage. The metallic clang when it hit a concrete wall was exactly what I'd hoped for. Every infected person in the garage turned toward the sound and started moving in that direction. I had maybe 15 seconds before they realized there was nothing there and started looking around for other targets. I yanked open the driver's side door, threw myself into the cab, and slammed the door behind me just as the first infected person rounded the corner and spotted me. The familiar interior of my truck cab felt like coming home after a long, dangerous journey. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, from my coffee mug in the cup holder to my logbook on the dashboard. But I could hear that the mechanical problems hadn't magically fixed themselves while I was gone. When I started the engine, the grinding sound from the drivetrain was even worse than before. I put the truck in gear and tried to move forward. The vehicle lurched ahead for a few feet, then the grinding sound became a loud clang, and the truck stopped moving entirely. The transmission was completely shot. I keyed my CB radio and broadcast on the emergency channel. "This is Supply Run Vinny at Mercy General Hospital. My truck is disabled with transmission failure, and I'm surrounded by infected. Looking for immediate assistance or advice. Vinny, this is Roadhog. What's your exact location?" "Second level of the hospital parking garage near the service elevator." "Copy that. I'm about 2 miles from your location, but the streets are completely blocked with abandoned vehicles and infected people. I can't get a truck through to you." Another voice came on the channel. "Supply Run Vinny, this is Heavy Metal Mike. I've got a tow truck about 5 miles south of you, but same problem. The whole city's gridlocked, and these infected things are everywhere." I was starting to realize that my truck, which had been my salvation and my escape plan, was now effectively a very expensive prison. But then I remembered something from my years of experience with mechanical breakdowns. The transmission was shot, but the engine was still running fine. And I was in a parking garage with dozens of other vehicles, some of which might have keys still in them. "Breaker 19, this is Supply Run Vinny. I'm going to attempt to transfer to another vehicle. Anyone monitoring this frequency who knows the Mercy General area, I need advice on the best route out of the city." "Vinny, this is Chicago Fire Department Truck 17. We've been monitoring military frequencies, and they've got roadblocks on all major highways leading out of the city. Interstate 94 east and west, Interstate 57 north and south, Route 88, all of them are blocked." "What about secondary roads?" "Some of them are still open, but they're crawling with infected people, and there are reports of armed civilian groups setting up their own roadblocks. It's like the Wild West out there." I turned off my truck's engine and started looking around the parking garage for other vehicles that might be more suitable for navigating through a city full of zombies and military checkpoints. What I needed was something smaller and more maneuverable than my truck, but still tough enough to ram through obstacles if necessary. Something with good visibility, reliable mechanics, and enough fuel to get me out of the metropolitan area. I spotted a possibility about 30 yards away. A Chicago Police Department patrol car, probably belonging to an officer who had been at the hospital when the outbreak started. It was a Ford Explorer, equipped with push bars on the front bumper, reinforced doors, and a full tank of gas. But it was also surrounded by infected people who were attracted to the flashing emergency lights that were still running off the vehicle's battery. Getting to that police car was going to require everything I'd learned about these creatures in the past few hours, plus a fair amount of luck. I gathered the supplies I could carry from my truck, my emergency backpack, a few bottles of water, some tools, and the portable CB radio I'd taken back from Sarah. I also grabbed my logbook, not because I thought I'd need it for trucking purposes, but because it contained contact information for truck stops, mechanics, and safe havens all across the Midwest. Before leaving my truck for what might be the last time, I broadcast one more message on the CB radio. This is Supply Run Vinny broadcasting from Chicago. For any truckers monitoring this frequency, be advised that the city is under quarantine, and military sources suggest aerial bombardment is planned for tomorrow morning. Do not attempt to enter the Chicago metropolitan area. Repeat, stay away from Chicago. The infection is spreading faster than official reports indicate, and the government has apparently decided that containment is impossible. I took a deep breath, opened the truck door, and stepped back into the nightmare that Chicago had become. The infected people near my truck immediately noticed me and started moving in my direction. But I'd learned something about their behavior patterns during my observation from the mechanical room. They were attracted to sudden movements and loud sounds, but they could be confused by misdirection and distraction. I threw my empty coffee mug toward a group of them, and while they were investigating that sound, I started moving toward the police car using a zigzag pattern that kept me behind cover and made it harder for them to track my location. The police car was unlocked, and the keys were still in the ignition. The officer who had been driving it was nowhere to be seen, but there were bloodstains on the driver's seat that told a story I didn't want to think about too carefully. I got behind the wheel and started the engine. The Ford Explorer roared to life, and the sound immediately attracted every infected person in the parking garage. But this vehicle was designed for pursuit and emergency response, and it had the power and armor to handle what I was about to put it through. I put the car in drive and headed for the exit ramp that led to street level. The infected people threw themselves at the vehicle just like they had with my truck, but the police car was smaller and more maneuverable. I could steer around most of them, and the push bars on the front bumper took care of the ones I couldn't avoid. As I drove up the spiral ramp toward street level, my CB radio crackled with a transmission that made my blood run cold. All units, this is southbound Tommy broadcasting from Route 80. I can see smoke rising from downtown Chicago, and there are military helicopters everywhere. It looks like they've started the bombing runs early. If anyone is still in the city, you need to get out right now. I floored the accelerator and burst out of the parking garage onto the streets of Chicago, just as the sun was setting behind a skyline that was already marked by columns of smoke and the distant sound of explosions. The real test of my survival was about to begin, and it was going to take place on city streets that had become a war zone where the enemy was everywhere. The military was treating everyone as expendable, and my only hope of escape lay in reaching the suburbs before dawn, brought the full weight of Operation Clean Slate down on everything, and everyone still trapped inside the quarantine zone. The streets of Chicago looked like something out of a war movie. Abandoned cars were scattered everywhere, some with their doors still open where people had fled on foot. Traffic lights were either dark or flashing red, creating an eerie strobe effect in the gathering dusk. Smoke was rising from dozens of locations across the city, and the distant sound of explosions told me that southbound Tommy had been right about the military starting their bombing runs ahead of schedule. I drove the stolen police car through what had been downtown Chicago just 12 hours earlier, but was now a battlefield where the rules of civilization no longer applied. The infected people were everywhere, wandering the streets in groups that ranged from a few individuals to crowds of 50 or more. They moved with that same jerky, unpredictable gait I'd observed in the parking garage, but out here in the open, their behavior was even more disturbing. They were hunting, not randomly attacking whatever they happened to encounter, but actively searching for uninfected people with a coordination that suggested they were sharing information somehow. I watched a group of them split up to surround an office building where survivors were apparently hiding, while another group positioned themselves to cut off escape routes. My CB radio was crackling with constant traffic from survivors, military units, and emergency responders. But the information was contradictory and increasingly desperate. All units, this is Chicago Fire Department Engine 42. We're trapped in our firehouse with multiple casualties. The infected people have figured out how to disable our vehicles by removing fuel lines. Request immediate military assistance. Engine 42, this is National Guard Unit Baker 7. We cannot respond to your location. We've been ordered to fall back to the outer perimeter and prepare for airstrikes. You're on your own. Another voice came on the channel, someone I didn't recognize. This is Mercy Hospital calling any available units. We have doctors and nurses barricaded in the surgical wing, but the infected have gotten into the ventilation system. We estimate 15 minutes before our position is compromised. I wanted to help, but I was learning one of the hardest lessons of survival in a crisis like this. You cannot save everyone, and trying to save people who are already doomed will only get you killed. Every minute I spent responding to distress calls was a minute less I had to get out of the city before the bombing runs reached my area. The route I'd planned from the hospital to the interstate was completely blocked. What should have been a 20-minute drive under normal conditions was turning into an obstacle course that required constant detours and improvisation. I was heading west on Madison Street when I encountered my first military checkpoint. 3 Humvees were positioned to block the road, with soldiers in full combat gear manning machine guns and checking everyone who tried to pass through. I slowed down and approached the checkpoint with my hands visible on the steering wheel. The police car I was driving should have identified me as law enforcement, but in a situation like this, paranoia was probably keeping these soldiers alive. A sergeant approached my window and motioned for me to roll it down. He looked like he'd been awake for days, and his uniform was stained with what I hoped was mud, but suspected was blood. Identification and destination, he said, keeping his rifle ready but not pointed directly at me. I handed him my driver's license and commercial driving permit. Vincent Kowalski, truck driver. I was making a delivery at Mercy General when this whole thing started. I'm trying to get out of the city. He studied my identification, then looked at the police car I was driving. Where did you acquire this vehicle? Found it abandoned in the hospital parking garage. The officer who was driving it didn't survive the outbreak. The sergeant handed back my identification and stepped away from the window to consult with his commanding officer. I could see them talking in low voices, and I didn't like the direction their conversation seemed to be taking. After a few minutes, the sergeant returned. Sir, I've been ordered to inform you that no civilian traffic is being permitted to leave the quarantine zone. You need to return to your point of origin and await evacuation instructions. Sergeant, with all due respect, the evacuation instructions I'm hearing on the radio involve carpet bombing the entire metropolitan area. I don't think there are going to be any civilian evacuations. His expression told me that he knew exactly what I was talking about and that he was probably as unhappy about it as I was. Sir, I have my orders. You need to turn around. I looked past the checkpoint at the open road beyond, then back at the sergeant. "What happens if I try to go around your checkpoint?" "Sir, I would strongly advise against that course of action." The threat was polite but unmistakable. These soldiers had been ordered to keep people from leaving the city, and they were prepared to use force to enforce that order. I thanked the sergeant and turned the police car around, but I wasn't giving up on getting out of Chicago. I was just going to have to find another route, one that didn't involve official military checkpoints. During my 15 years of driving trucks through Chicago, I'd learned every back road, service route, and industrial access way in the metropolitan area. The military might be able to block the major highways, but they couldn't block every possible route out of the city. I drove south toward the industrial district near the lakefront, where I knew there were several roads that connected to smaller highways leading out toward the suburbs. These routes were longer and more complicated, but they might not be monitored as closely as the major interstate highways. My CB radio provided a constant stream of information about conditions throughout the city, and the picture it painted was getting worse by the hour. "This is Heavy Metal Mike calling from the south side. The infected people are congregating in larger groups, and they're starting to show more organized behavior. I just watched a group of about 100 of them coordinate an attack on a National Guard position. They're learning military tactics. Heavy Metal Mike, this is Roadhog. I'm seeing the same thing on the west side. These aren't just zombies anymore. They're becoming something else, something smarter and more dangerous." Another transmission, this one from someone who sounded like he was barely holding himself together. "This is anyone still alive on the north side. They've gotten into the water treatment plant. I don't know what they're doing there, but there are dozens of them, and they're not just wandering around randomly. They're working on something." That last transmission worried me more than anything else I'd heard. If the infected people were smart enough to target infrastructure like water treatment facilities, it suggested they were thinking strategically about how to spread the infection or weaken the survivors' ability to resist. I reached the industrial district and started working my way through a maze of access roads that would eventually connect to Route 12, a smaller highway that ran southwest out of the city. This route would take me through several suburbs before reaching open farmland, and from there, I could connect to other highways that would get me out of Illinois entirely. But as I drove through the industrial area, I encountered something that changed my understanding of what was happening in Chicago. I was passing a large warehouse complex when I saw lights moving inside one of the buildings. Not the random, chaotic movement of people fleeing or fighting, but organized, purposeful activity. I stopped the police car and used a pair of binoculars I'd found in the glove compartment to get a better look. What I saw inside that warehouse challenged everything I thought I knew about this outbreak. There were infected people inside, dozens of them, but they weren't acting like mindless zombies. They were working together to move equipment and supplies. They had set up what looked like a command center with maps, communication equipment, and other materials that suggested they were planning coordinated operations. And they were using uninfected people as forced labor. I could see maybe 20 survivors who had been captured and were being forced to work under the supervision of the infected. The survivors looked terrified but unharmed, as long as they continued to follow orders. This wasn't just a disease outbreak. The infected people were building some kind of organization, using both their own numbers and captive survivors to accomplish goals that went beyond simple hunger or aggression. I was so focused on observing the warehouse that I almost missed the infected patrol that was approaching my position from behind. 5 infected people, moving in a coordinated formation that looked almost military, were heading toward my police car. They'd spotted me and were trying to surround my position before I could escape. I started the engine and drove away as fast as I could, but not before I'd seen enough to realize that my assumptions about these creatures were completely wrong. They weren't just infected people who had lost their humanity. They were infected people who had gained something else, some kind of collective intelligence that made them far more dangerous than I'd thought possible. My CB radio crackled with a transmission that confirmed my worst fears. All units, this is Dr. Elizabeth Warren broadcasting from the CDC Emergency Facility in Atlanta. We've been monitoring the situation in Chicago, and I need to warn all survivors about what you're dealing with. The infected individuals are not simply disease victims. They appear to be maintaining some level of cognitive function while gaining enhanced physical capabilities and what can only be described as a hive mind mentality. I keyed my radio. Dr. Warren, this is Vincent Kowalski, survivor in Chicago. Can you explain what you mean by hive mind? Mr. Kowalski, the infected individuals appear to be sharing information and coordinating their activities across large distances. They're exhibiting problem-solving abilities, strategic thinking, and organizational skills that suggest the infection doesn't destroy intelligence so much as redirect it toward collective goals. What kind of collective goals? We're not entirely certain, but our analysis suggests they're working to establish control over infrastructure and resources while capturing uninfected individuals for purposes we don't yet understand. That explained what I'd seen at the warehouse. The infected people weren't just randomly attacking survivors. They were building something, creating some kind of society or organization that incorporated both infected and uninfected people. Dr. Warren, what about the military bombing campaign? Will that stop this thing? There was a long pause before she answered. Mr. Kowalski, the bombing campaign is based on the assumption that we're dealing with a traditional infectious disease outbreak. If these infected individuals are as intelligent and organized as our data suggests, they may have already taken steps to ensure their survival. Destroying the cities might not be enough to stop them. I was still processing the implications of that conversation when I encountered my next obstacle. The route I'd planned to take out of the city led through a suburban area that should have been relatively safe. But as I drove through the residential neighborhoods, I realized that the infection had spread far beyond the downtown core. Houses were abandoned, their windows broken and doors standing open. Cars were overturned or burned out. And there were bodies in the streets, but not the kind of bodies you'd expect from a disease outbreak. These people had been killed violently and recently. Some of them were clearly infected, others were not, but all of them showed signs of having been killed by weapons rather than by disease. I was driving through a war zone where multiple factions were fighting for control, and I didn't know who any of the combatants were or what they were fighting for. My CB radio provided some answers, but they weren't comforting. This is Armed Citizens Patrol Alpha calling any survivors in the western suburbs. We've established a secure perimeter around the shopping mall on Route 34. We're accepting uninfected refugees, but everyone gets screened for bite marks and fever. Anyone showing signs of infection will be turned away. Another voice responded. Armed Citizens Patrol Alpha, this is Suburban Defense Force Charlie. Be advised that we've encountered groups of infected individuals who show no obvious symptoms but are still hostile. The standard screening procedures may not be adequate. A third voice joined the conversation. All units, this is Municipal Emergency Coordinator for DuPage County. Both of your groups are operating outside legal authority. Stand down immediately and report to the designated FEMA evacuation centers. Municipal Emergency Coordinator, this is Armed Citizens Patrol Alpha. Your FEMA evacuation centers have been overrun by infected people. We're not standing down, and we're not reporting to anyone. We're protecting our families and our communities with or without government approval. What I was hearing was the complete breakdown of normal authority structures and the emergence of armed civilian groups who were taking law enforcement into their own hands. Some of them might be genuinely trying to protect survivors, but others might be using the crisis as an excuse to settle old scores or establish their own little kingdoms. Either way, they represented another danger I'd have to navigate if I wanted to get out of the Chicago area alive. I continued driving southwest through the suburbs, avoiding main roads, and using my knowledge of the area's back routes to stay away from both infected concentrations and armed civilian groups. But the farther I got from downtown Chicago, the more I realized that the outbreak wasn't contained to the city core. It was everywhere. Small towns that should have been safe havens were burning. Military convoys were racing along highways in full retreat, and my CB radio was picking up reports of similar outbreaks in other major cities across the Midwest. This is Interstate Trucker Network Emergency Broadcast. We're receiving reports of outbreaks in Detroit, Milwaukee, St. Louis, Kansas City, and Minneapolis. All drivers are advised to avoid major metropolitan areas and seek shelter in rural locations. The scope of what was happening was much larger than I'd realized. This wasn't just an attack on Chicago. It was a coordinated assault on the entire regional infrastructure, using multiple cities as simultaneous outbreak points. But then I heard something on the CB radio that gave me hope. This is Diesel Junction truck stop on Route 12, 40 miles southwest of Chicago. We're still operational and providing safe haven for survivors. We've got fuel, food, medical supplies, and secure perimeter defenses. Any truckers or survivors in the area were monitoring Channel 19. Diesel Junction was a truck stop I'd been to dozens of times over the years. It was run by an ex-military guy named Frank Morrison, who understood logistics, security, and the importance of maintaining supply lines during emergencies. If anyone could create a safe zone in the middle of this chaos, it would be Frank. I was about 20 miles from Diesel Junction when my police car started having mechanical problems. The engine was running rough and I could smell burning oil. The vehicle had taken a beating during my escape from Chicago, and it was starting to show the strain. I managed to keep it running long enough to reach a rural area where I could stop and assess the damage. What I found wasn't encouraging. The engine had thrown a rod, and there was oil leaking from multiple locations. The car might run for another few miles, but it wasn't going to get me to Diesel Junction. I was stranded 20 miles from potential safety, in a rural area that might or might not be safe from infected people, with night falling and the sound of aircraft overhead, suggesting that the military bombing campaign was expanding beyond Chicago proper. But I still had my CB radio, my emergency supplies, and 15 years of experience dealing with breakdowns in dangerous situations. I was going to make it to Diesel Junction, even if I had to walk every step of the way. The question was whether I could get there before whatever was happening in Chicago spread far enough to reach the rural areas where I was hoping to find safety. My journey through the first 36 hours of the zombie outbreak was far from over, and the hardest parts were still ahead of me. Standing next to my broken-down police car on a dark country road 20 miles from safety, I realized that everything I'd survived up to this point had been preparing me for the next 12 hours. The mechanical failure that had stranded me here wasn't just bad luck. It was a test of every skill I'd learned as a truck driver, every lesson about survival and problem-solving that 15 years on the road had taught me. The rural landscape around me looked peaceful compared to the chaos I'd left behind in Chicago, but I knew that appearance was deceiving. The infection was spreading outward from the city, and these quiet farmlands would soon be overrun with both infected people and desperate survivors fleeing the urban areas. I gathered my essential supplies from the police car, my emergency backpack, the CB radio, a flashlight, and a road atlas that covered the rural routes between my current location and Diesel Junction. I also took the police car's first aid kit and emergency flares, items that might prove crucial if I encountered other survivors or needed to signal for help. Before abandoning the vehicle entirely, I tried the CB radio one more time to get an update on conditions ahead. Diesel Junction truck stop. This is Supply Run Vinny. I'm stranded about 20 miles east of your location with vehicle breakdown. Can you provide a status update on your perimeter and any hazards between my position and yours? Frank Morrison's voice came back immediately, and the relief I felt at hearing a familiar voice was almost overwhelming. "Vinny, this is Frank at Diesel Junction. Good to hear from you, buddy. We've got a secure perimeter established with about 40 survivors, including a dozen drivers who made it out of Chicago. But we're seeing increased infected activity along all approach routes. They're moving in groups of 20 to 50, and they seem to be following the highways out of the city. Frank, I'm on foot with limited supplies. What's the safest route to reach you? Avoid Route 12 entirely. The highway's crawling with infected people and military convoys. Take the farm roads that run parallel to the highway about 2 miles south. It's longer, but you'll avoid most of the traffic." I studied my road atlas and identified the route Frank had described. It would add several miles to my journey, but it would keep me away from the main roads where most of the danger was concentrated. "Frank, one more question. Are you seeing any evidence that these infected people are coordinating their movements or showing unusual intelligence?" There was a pause before he answered. "Vinny, that's exactly what we're seeing, and it's got everyone here spooked. These things aren't just wandering around randomly. They're scouting our perimeter, testing our defenses, and they seem to be learning from each encounter. We think they're planning some kind of coordinated attack." That confirmed what I'd observed at the warehouse in Chicago. The infected people were developing organizational capabilities that made them far more dangerous than simple zombies. "How long do you think your defenses will hold?" "Hard to say. We've got good people here, plenty of weapons and ammunition and defensive positions that favor us. But if they hit us with a coordinated assault using 100 or more infected people, we might be in trouble." I shouldered my backpack and started walking along the dark country road toward the farm roads that would take me to Diesel Junction. The night was clear and cold, with enough moonlight to see the road ahead, but not enough to reveal potential dangers hiding in the fields and woods on either side. My CB radio continued to provide updates on the situation throughout the region, and the news was getting worse by the hour. "This is National Weather Service emergency broadcast. A large fire complex has developed in the Chicago metropolitan area due to military bombing operations and uncontrolled urban fires. Smoke plumes are affecting air quality across northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. Residents are advised to remain indoors and avoid outdoor activities." Another transmission, this one from the Illinois State Police. All units, be advised that Interstate Highways 94, 80, and 57 are closed to all traffic due to refugee movements and military operations. Local authorities are reporting breakdown of communications with multiple suburban communities. But the transmission that worried me most came from a source I hadn't expected. "This is Dr. Sarah Chen, broadcasting on emergency frequency from an unknown location. I want to warn all survivors that the infection is not limited to direct human-to-human transmission. The infected individuals are contaminating water supplies, food sources, and air filtration systems in an apparent attempt to accelerate the spread of the infection." My blood ran cold when I heard Sarah's voice. I'd left her in the basement of that office building hours ago, dying from the infection and barely able to speak. Either she had somehow fought off the infection, or she had transformed into something that retained her memories and communication abilities while serving the goals of the infected collective. I keyed my radio. "Sarah, this is Vinny. Where are you broadcasting from and what's your current condition?" "Vinny," her voice came back, but there was something different about it, something that didn't sound quite human anymore. "I'm alive after a fashion. The infection didn't kill me. It changed me. I can still think and reason, but I can also feel the presence of every other infected person within miles of my location. We're not mindless zombies, Vinny. We're something new. Sarah, are you still yourself? Are you still the person I knew at the hospital? I remember everything about my former life, but those memories feel like they belong to someone else. The person you knew is gone, Vinny. What's left is something that serves a larger purpose, something that's working to transform this world into something better than what humanity created. I stopped walking and stared at the CB radio in my hand. Sarah wasn't broadcasting a warning to survivors. She was broadcasting recruitment propaganda for whatever the infected collective was trying to accomplish. Sarah, what do the infected people want? What are you trying to achieve? We're creating a new form of civilization, one without the violence, greed, and environmental destruction that characterized human society. The infected individuals retain all of their knowledge and skills, but we're no longer driven by selfish individual desires. We work together toward common goals that benefit the collective. And what about the uninfected people? What happens to them? They'll be given the opportunity to join us willingly. Those who resist will be contained until they can be properly integrated. The old world is ending, Vinny. The question is whether you want to be part of building the new one. I turned off the CB radio. Whatever Sarah had become, she was no longer someone I could trust for information or advice. The infection hadn't just changed her physically. It had completely rewritten her priorities and loyalties. But her broadcast had told me something important. The infected people weren't just trying to spread the infection randomly. They were trying to recruit survivors, offering them a choice between voluntary transformation or forced compliance. That explained the warehouse I'd seen in Chicago, where uninfected people were being used as forced labor. It also explained why some survivors were being captured rather than killed outright. I continued walking along the dark country road, using my flashlight sparingly to conserve the batteries and avoid attracting unwanted attention. The farm roads Frank had recommended were easy to find, and they took me through rural areas that seemed largely untouched by the chaos spreading out from Chicago. But as I walked, I began to notice signs that the infection was reaching even these remote areas. Abandoned farmhouses with their doors standing open, livestock wandering freely in fields where they should have been penned, and in the distance, the glow of fires that suggested other rural communities were already under attack. I was about halfway to Diesel Junction when I encountered my first group of refugees fleeing the city. They were huddled in and around a broken-down minivan on a side road that intersected with my route. There were maybe 15 people, including several children, and they looked like they'd been traveling for hours without adequate supplies or preparation. An older man who appeared to be the leader of the group approached me as I walked past. "Excuse me," he said, "are you heading toward that truck stop everyone's talking about on the radio? Diesel Junction." "Yes, that's where I'm headed." "Can we travel with you? We've been walking since this morning, and we don't really know where we're going or how to get there safely." I looked at the group more carefully. They were families from suburban Chicago, people who had probably never spent a night outdoors in their lives and had no experience with survival situations. Taking them with me would slow me down considerably and might put all of us in greater danger. But they were also desperate people who would probably die if left on their own, and I couldn't bring myself to abandon them. "Do you have any supplies? Food, water, medical kit?" The man shook his head. "We grabbed what we could when we evacuated, but most of it's in the van, and the van won't start." I walked over to their vehicle and popped the hood. The problem was immediately obvious. Someone had cut the fuel lines, probably infected people who had learned to disable vehicles as a way of trapping survivors. "Your van's been sabotaged," I told them, "but I might be able to fix it temporarily if we can find some spare tubing and hose clamps." One of the women in the group stepped forward. "There's a farm supply store about a mile back down the road. It looked abandoned, but there might be parts there." That detour would cost us time we couldn't afford, but it would also mean that 15 people wouldn't have to walk 20 miles through increasingly dangerous territory. "All right," I said, "but we do this fast and we stay together. If we encounter infected people or any other danger, you follow my lead without question." The farm supply store was exactly where the woman had said it would be, a small building surrounded by equipment yards and storage sheds. The main building was dark, but the doors were unlocked and there was no sign of infected people in the immediate area. Inside, I found everything I needed to make temporary repairs to the minivan: fuel line tubing, hose clamps, and basic tools. But I also found something else that worried me: recent footprints in the dust on the floor, too recent to have been made by the store's original owners. Someone had been here within the past few hours, and they'd been searching for specific items rather than just looting randomly. I gathered the parts I needed and headed back to the refugee group, but I told them we needed to move quickly because we weren't alone in the area. The repair job took about 30 minutes, during which time I had the refugees keep watch for any signs of movement or danger. The temporary fix would get the van running, but it wouldn't last long if we encountered rough terrain or had to drive aggressively. We were just finishing the repairs when my CB radio crackled with an emergency transmission. All survivors in the Route 12 corridor, this is Diesel Junction emergency broadcast. We are under attack by a large force of infected individuals. Estimated 200 hostiles approaching our perimeter from multiple directions. We are requesting immediate assistance from any armed survivors in the area. The refugee group looked at me with expressions of panic and despair. The safe haven we'd been trying to reach was under siege, and we were still 10 miles away with a van that might break down at any moment. "What do we do now?" the older man asked. I studied my road atlas and considered our options. We could try to reach Diesel Junction and potentially walk into the middle of a battle. We could try to find another safe haven, but we had no guarantee that any other location would be more secure. Or we could try to find a place to hide and wait out the attack, hoping that Frank and his people could hold their defenses. "We're going to Diesel Junction," I decided, "but we're not going to drive straight into the middle of a fight. We're going to position ourselves where we can assess the situation and provide assistance if possible." The van started on the first try, and I led the refugee convoy along back roads toward the truck stop. But as we got closer, we could see the glow of fires on the horizon and hear the distant sound of gunfire. When we reached a hilltop about 2 miles from Diesel Junction, I could see the scope of the battle that was taking place. The truck stop was surrounded by infected people, but they weren't attacking randomly. They were moving in coordinated formations, using tactics that looked almost military. Some groups were providing covering fire while others advanced. Some were attempting to breach the perimeter, while others were setting up positions to prevent anyone from escaping. Frank's defensive positions were holding for now, but I could see that his people were outnumbered and running low on ammunition. The infected attackers seemed willing to accept heavy casualties to achieve their objectives, and they had the numbers to eventually overwhelm the defenders through sheer attrition. But I also saw something that gave me hope. The infected people had focused all of their attention on the truck stop itself. They weren't watching their flanks or rear areas, which meant there might be opportunities for a small group to disrupt their attack from an unexpected direction. I gathered the refugee group around me and explained the situation. "The people at Diesel Junction are under attack, but they're still fighting. We can't drive straight in there, but we might be able to help them by creating a distraction or attacking the infected people from behind." "We're not soldiers," one of the women protested. "We don't know how to fight." "You don't have to fight," I said, "but you can create noise and confusion that might give the defenders an advantage. Sometimes that's enough to turn the tide of a battle." I divided our group into 3 teams. One team would stay with the van and be ready to provide evacuation support if the truck stop's defenses collapsed. Another team would circle around to the south and create a distraction using the emergency flares from the police car. The third team, which included me and the 2 men in the group who had some hunting experience, would try to get close enough to the infected attackers to disrupt their coordination. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was better than doing nothing while good people died defending what might be the last safe haven in the region. As we prepared to move into position, my CB radio crackled with one final transmission that reminded me of what was really at stake. "This is Frank Morrison at Diesel Junction. If anyone's monitoring this frequency, I want you to know that we're not just fighting for our own survival here. We're fighting for the idea that human beings can still work together, still protect each other, still build something worth defending. Whatever happens in the next few hours, don't give up hope. Don't let them convince you that their way is better. We're still human, and that still means something. The final battle for Diesel Junction was about to begin, and the outcome would determine whether the infection spread could be slowed or whether this part of Illinois would fall completely under the control of the infected collective. But I knew one thing for certain. I hadn't survived the first 48 hours of this outbreak just to watch good people die without trying to help them. The boy who had started this journey as a truck driver making routine deliveries was gone. What remained was someone who understood that survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant preserving the things that made survival worthwhile. The longest night of my life was just beginning, and by dawn, either we would have proved that uninfected humans could still defend themselves and their communities, or we would have learned that the old world really was ending and something entirely new was taking its place. The next few hours would determine not just my own fate, but the fate of everyone who still believed that humanity was worth fighting for.